Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
It was one of those days where the sun is too bright, the grass is too green, and the air feels heavy with performative happiness. The kind of day you only get at suburban backyard birthday parties, where everything is staged for Instagram but feels hollow when you're actually living it. My nephew Eli was turning 8, which meant a themed bounce house, overpriced cupcakes that looked better than they tasted, and a lawn full of folding chairs occupied by parents trying to outdo each other in casual conversation. Everyone looked like they belonged in a Hallmark commercial, and I was the off-brand character nobody could place, dressed in black jeans and a plain blouse, sipping from a paper cup of lemonade like it might turn into wine if I wished hard enough. I hadn't been there 5 minutes before I saw it coming, the spotlight moment that my mother, Carol, always saved for family gatherings. She was already holding court near the picnic table, surrounded by Jason's co-workers and a couple of neighborhood friends she had strategically invited, like a casting director curating an audience for her favorite son's latest achievement. I knew the rhythm. First, she'd talk about how Jason had just been promoted to vice president of regional operations, whatever that even meant. Then she'd slide into his new house with the finished basement and the boat they just happened to get a great deal on. She'd end with the classic line she used every time he did something vaguely adult. "I just don't know where he gets it from. Must be his father." Cue the laughter, cue the subtle, slicing glance in my direction. I stood near the cooler, pretending to look for ice while trying not to roll my eyes. The thing is, I'm not jealous of Jason. I never have been. He plays the game exactly how they taught us to. Show up early, follow the rules, climb the ladder, and never ask why the ladder exists in the first place. He was always Mom's ideal child. Clean-cut, predictable, and never once came home with a shaved head or a philosophy book, unlike me. Still, even after all these years, the script hadn't changed, and it amazed me how desperately she still needed to perform it. It happened just as Eli was unwrapping a Lego set. His face lit up with the kind of joy adults spend their whole lives trying to get back to. Mom clapped and laughed with him, then turned to her little crowd, like a talk show host wrapping up a segment. "You know," she said, "Jason's been working so hard this year. That promotion didn't come easy, but he earned every bit of it." The people around her gave the polite nods and smiles you'd expect. Then, like clockwork, she pivoted. Her eyes found mine, and I could feel the temperature drop, even though the sun was still blazing overhead. "And you, sweetie," she said loud enough for at least 2 tables to hear, "still working from home?" The way she said it, it wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. Like I had a condition. Like working from home was synonymous with not working at all, or worse, still stuck in the same aimless phase I'd supposedly been in since I graduated. The word "still" carried the weight of every phone call where she asked if I was doing okay financially or if I'd thought about going back to school. Everyone around us went quiet in that awkward, expectant way people do when a family microaggression unfolds in public, and they're not sure whether to laugh or pretend they didn't hear. I could have laughed it off. I could have said something passive or non-committal and waited for the moment to pass like I had so many times before. But this time, something shifted. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the fact that the acquisition paperwork had been signed that very morning. Or maybe, just maybe, I was finally too tired to keep pretending that their version of success had anything to do with mine. So I smiled. Not the forced, brittle smile I'd worn through years of family functions, but a real one, soft, deliberate, and just a little bit dangerous. And I said, in a voice that didn't rise or fall, didn't beg for recognition or come wrapped in sarcasm, just a plain and steady truth. That's what happens when you run the company. For a moment, the words just hung there, like the scent of ozone right before a storm hits. I didn't need to say more. I didn't want to. Her face went pale, not in the dramatic, theatrical way. No hand to the chest, no gasping, just a subtle draining, like the blood had quietly decided to evacuate. Jason turned toward me, blinked twice, and actually tilted his head like a dog hearing an unfamiliar noise. There it was, the pause, the disruption of the narrative, and I didn't rush to fill it. I just turned, walked over to Eli, knelt beside him, and helped him tear open the box. "Let's build it," I told him. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. Because in that moment, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't defending my choices. I was just done playing their game. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of the party guests. Older woman, expensive sunglasses, not someone I recognized. Walk over to where I'd left my drink. She picked it up, looked toward me, and said almost casually, "Excuse me, are you? Wait, I think I saw your name in Forbes." My mother turned sharply, her jaw tightening just enough to betray the effort it took to hold her composure. Jason stepped closer to hear better, his phone suddenly forgotten. And me? I just smiled again, this time with teeth. Because the thing about revenge, real, satisfying revenge, is that it doesn't come from shouting. It comes from letting people see, too late, that they never understood who you were in the first place. And this was just the first crack in the perfect family portrait. If there's one thing I've learned from growing up in a family like mine, it's that people don't always have to shout to humiliate you. Sometimes they just have to smile, tilt their heads, and use that carefully sharpened tone that wraps condescension in silk, making it sound like concern or love or maternal disappointment. But in truth, it cuts deeper than anything blunt or loud ever could. That day at the party, when Mom asked her question and I answered in a way she wasn't prepared for, it didn't just shut her up, it made her realize she might have missed something big. But to understand why it landed so hard, you have to go back years, back to the long, steady erosion of self-worth that happens when your family sees you not as who you are, but as who you failed to become in their eyes. It started small, as these things often do. I remember being 19, home from college for the summer, sitting in the kitchen in my pajama pants, coding something no one cared about, and Mom walked in, glanced at the screen, and said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, "You're still doing that app thing?" She said it like someone commenting on a child playing dress-up, amused by my stubborn insistence on living in a world of imagination instead of waking up to real life, which in her mind meant a cubicle, a blazer, and a predictable 401k. And it didn't matter how much I tried to explain the technology, the users, the traction. It never registered. Because in her mind, if I didn't have a boss, a title, and a building to walk into every morning, then what I had wasn't real. It was a phase, a hobby, a prolonged teenage rebellion dressed up in tech jargon. Jason, of course, was the opposite. He had always been her golden boy, athletic, clean-cut, always said the right thing, and never once questioned the rules. When he got his first internship at that consulting firm, Mom printed out the email and stuck it on the fridge like it was a kindergarten art project. When I got accepted into an incubator program, out of hundreds of applicants, she squinted at the letter and asked if it meant I'd be getting a real job soon. And the thing is, I stopped trying to correct her. I stopped trying to explain. You can only hit a brick wall so many times before you start to bleed. But I didn't stop building. I worked 12-hour days in that tiny apartment, eating cold noodles and fighting imposter syndrome with every new user we onboarded. I pitched investors in coffee shops, learned to fix bugs at 2 in the morning, and hired my first contractor off Reddit because I couldn't afford anyone else. And through all of it, through the debt, the doubt, the nights where I wondered if I was just too stubborn to quit, my family continued to treat me like I was doing some extended arts and crafts project with no real future. Every holiday became a ritual of endurance. Jason would arrive with his pressed shirt and shiny new company car. Mom would beam like she'd birthed royalty, and I would get a polite smile and a question that always began with, Still not married? Still working from home? Still doing that app thing?" And each time I'd nod, smile, and say something vague, because the truth would have meant entering a debate I was too exhausted to have. It's funny how families can make you question yourself in ways strangers never could. I could convince a boardroom full of venture capitalists that our metrics were solid, that our growth was sustainable, that our market strategy was airtight. But one look from my mother and I felt like a teenager who hadn't cleaned her room. That's the damage, you see. It's not the words themselves. It's the years of repetition, the subtle digs, the comparisons, the hierarchy you never signed up for, but keep getting pushed down. But despite all of it, or maybe because of it, I kept going, not for them, not to prove anything, but because deep down, I believed in what I was building, and more than that, I knew what it meant to me to be self-made in a world that didn't want me to be. And then one day it happened. We hit our numbers, we went viral, we got featured. Investors started calling instead of the other way around. And that app thing they dismissed? It became a company with real revenue, real employees, and eventually a real offer. A number with 7 digits and a future I had once barely allowed myself to dream of. And on the day that offer came through, when my lawyer confirmed the terms, I didn't tell my family, not yet. I didn't want their approval. I wanted something more dangerous. I wanted silence. So when that birthday party came around and I found myself standing in the same backyard I'd stood in so many times before, surrounded by pastel balloons, sugary punch, and conversations about summer camps and mortgage rates, I decided to play along just for a little while longer. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't in proving someone wrong loudly. It's in letting them live in the illusion just long enough for reality to smack them sideways. That's why I didn't correct Mom when she asked her usual question. That's why I let the day roll on with its predictable awkwardness. But when my phone buzzed and I saw the text, just 5 words from my CFO that changed everything, I smiled. Congrats, deal is closed. Celebrate. That was it. No fireworks, no parade. Just a message sent quietly from someone who had stood beside me when I couldn't afford an assistant, who had believed in me before the money came in, and who now sat at the table of a company no one had expected to make it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to post, because I knew what was coming. They had no idea. But they would. Dinner that evening wasn't so much a meal as it was a performance, an orchestrated affair where each plate and each comment seemed carefully curated, as though the entire event was designed to reinforce a narrative my mother had spent years constructing, brick by brick, with my brother Jason as its golden statue, standing proudly in the center, while the rest of us, especially me, remained relegated to the supporting cast. The long wooden table stretched across the patio, set with mismatched cushions and cloth napkins that looked hand-sewn but were probably from a boutique that sold curated authenticity to women like my mother, who loved the appearance of effort more than the labor itself. Jason sat at the far end, his voice carrying like it always did when he had a captive audience, and he used that space to its fullest, recounting stories from work that were half jargon, half ego, and entirely unchallenged, because no one ever interrupted Jason, not even when he was wrong, not even when he confused correlation with causation in some triumphant story about market trends. People laughed in the right places, nodded like they understood, and occasionally offered follow-up questions, which he always answered with the confidence of someone who had never had to worry about being underestimated. I watched from my seat near the middle of the table, quietly sipping my wine and listening as he explained the difference between leadership and management, like he had invented the concept, while Mom nodded along as if he were Moses coming down from the mountain with stone tablets on corporate synergy. It was almost comforting in a way, the predictability of it all, the way they operated as though the world hadn't changed, as though value was still defined by who wore a tie to work and who got invited to golf tournaments. And then he arrived. Thomas Bishop didn't so much walk onto the patio as glide into it. An older man, somewhere in his 60s, with that understated elegance that made you notice him without quite knowing why. His blazer was expensive but subtle, his shoes polished but not flashy, and the way he carried himself suggested that he had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He didn't smile widely or shake every hand. He simply stepped into the space like he owned none of it, but could have if he wanted to, which, knowing him, wasn't far from the truth. He was an early investor in my company, one of the few who had seen potential when all I had was a prototype and a pitch deck that kept crashing my laptop. But more than that, he had become a kind of silent mentor, offering not just money but perspective, the kind of clarity you only get from someone who has built empires and burned bridges and still knows which was more satisfying. I hadn't expected him to come, not really, but when I texted him earlier that week out of sheer impulse, telling him about the party and half joking that it might be fun for him to witness suburban theater at its finest, he replied with a thumbs up and a single sentence. Might be time. I didn't know what that meant until I saw him step onto the patio. And then I understood immediately he was here to watch the mask fall. Jason, ever the peacock, stood up and offered his hand, already mid-introduction before Thomas had even made it to the table. Hey there, welcome, he said, smiling like a candidate at a fundraiser. Jason Lawrence, VP of Regional Ops at Midstate Holdings. We do commercial development, mostly B2B, but I handle our acquisitions portfolio. He paused, probably waiting for the polite murmur of interest. Thomas didn't blink. He shook Jason's hand without ceremony and gave a small nod before turning toward me. Actually, Jason, he said, his voice even and unhurried. We've met briefly, but I'm here for your sister. The silence that followed wasn't awkward in the usual sense. It was surgical, clean, precise, and cold. Jason's face froze in that half smile, the kind that looks charming in photographs, but collapses when unsupported by confidence. He glanced at me, then back at Thomas, his confusion naked on his face. Mom, sitting beside him, leaned forward, her lips twitching as she tried to control whatever response was starting to boil beneath her polished exterior. I'm sorry, she said, her voice tight. I didn't catch your name. Thomas Bishop, he replied with that same detached grace. I'm an investor, been working with your daughter for a few years now. We just closed a $42 million funding round for her company, significant valuation. You must be incredibly proud. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The blood drained from her face so quickly I almost reached for the salt, just to make sure she was still breathing. She blinked once, then again, her mouth opening slightly before closing again, as if trying to reorder a script that had suddenly torn itself in half. Jason sat down slowly, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation, the kind of look a man gives when the rules he built his ego around stop working without warning. There was no applause, no gasps, just the heavy, uncomfortable weight of people trying to recalculate where they had placed their respect and who they had given it to, like a table tilting ever so slightly and making you suddenly aware that your glass is in danger of tipping over. Thomas took the seat next to me, adjusted his napkin, and began buttering a roll like we were at a regular dinner party, as though he hadn't just dismantled a decade of assumptions with a handful of words. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of my lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to be mistaken for one. For the rest of the evening, Jason barely spoke. He picked at his food, glanced at his phone, and avoided eye contact like a man navigating a minefield in the dark. Mom tried to recover, asking Thomas polite questions about his business background. But it was too late. The spell was broken. The story she'd always told, the one where Jason was the star and I was the afterthought, was beginning to unravel. And the best part? I hadn't said a word. Because the real power isn't in proving someone wrong. It's in letting the truth sit beside them at the dinner table, eating from their plates and sipping their wine, until they're forced to see it for what it is, not an attack, not a performance, but simply a fact they can no longer ignore. And this was just the beginning. If there's one thing my mother has always excelled at, Beyond maintaining the illusion of domestic perfection or baking cookies that looked like magazine covers but tasted like drywall, it's control, not the loud, overbearing kind that shouts you down or slams doors, but the slow drip, insidious kind that comes dressed in politeness, wrapped in passive-aggressive concern, and executed with surgical precision, like a chess player who sacrifices pawns with a smile just to trap your queen 5 moves later. For as long as I could remember, Carol Lawrence had held the reins of our family narrative so tightly that no one dared even question where we were going or whether we ever wanted to get there. So sitting at that dinner table, watching her blink in slow, mechanical confusion as Thomas Bishop casually mentioned my multi-million-dollar funding round, was not just satisfying, it was seismic. She didn't implode, of course. That wasn't her style. My mother was not the kind of woman to create a scene or raise her voice. Instead, she folded inward, her expression smoothing into something unreadable, like a poker player realizing the game had shifted while she was still admiring her hand. The muscles around her mouth tightened, and her next few bites were so delicate, so deliberate, I could practically hear the internal dialogue behind them. Don't react, don't lose face, don't give her the satisfaction, because that's what it was in her mind. Not a moment of genuine pride in her daughter's accomplishments, not a shift in perspective or a quiet reckoning with her own biases, but a challenge, a disruption, a threat to the hierarchy she had curated like a flower bed, with Jason planted front and center and me tucked somewhere behind the shrubs, visible only when she needed to display her capacity for maternal patience. What she didn't understand, what she had never understood, was that I had stopped playing her game years ago. I no longer needed her validation, no longer sought her approval like a starving child reaching for crumbs. But that didn't mean I hadn't kept score. Oh, I had kept score. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with the quiet precision of someone who knew that one day, all the little humiliations, all the dismissive glances, all the Sunday dinners where Jason's spreadsheets were applauded and my prototypes were ignored, would come back around, not as vengeance, but as revelation. And now, here we were, 3 courses in, and the story had finally changed. Jason, to his credit, was doing his best to pretend he didn't care, but the way he kept checking his phone and shifting in his chair told a different story. He wasn't just blindsided, he was dethroned. For so long, he had worn his achievements like armor, using every promotion, every corner office, every new client contract as proof of his superiority, never once questioning the system that had handed him the playbook and congratulated him for following it to the letter. But now, he was sitting across from a man who had invested millions in a company Jason didn't even know existed, run by a sister he had barely acknowledged in years, except to ask if she was still doing that tech thing. And worse, he couldn't dismiss it. He couldn't roll his eyes or change the subject, because Thomas Bishop wasn't just anyone. He was someone who mattered in the circles Jason wanted to enter, and he had come for me. I could feel the power shift, not in grand declarations, but in subtleties. The way people at the table began glancing in my direction more often, the slight change in tone when they addressed me, the way Mom's friends, who had always treated me like a curiosity, now leaned in a little closer when I spoke. It wasn't validation, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And that, for someone like me, who had spent decades being treated as the family's cautionary tale, was more than enough. At some point, between dessert and coffee, I stood up, not abruptly, but with intention, and excused myself, walking back into the house with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I needed a break from the charade, needed air that wasn't filled with the scent of performative reconciliation. As I passed the kitchen island, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I had brought with me, not out of spite, not as a weapon, but as a gesture of something that had always existed between me and the one person in that family who, despite his silence, had never made me feel small. My father was sitting alone in the living room, a book in his lap and his reading glasses pushed up into his hair, as if he had started reading but couldn't focus long enough to finish a paragraph. He looked up as I entered, and there was something in his eyes, not surprise, not pride, but relief, as though he had been waiting for this moment longer than even I had. "I want you to have this," I said, handing him the envelope without preamble. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling just slightly, and when he saw the check inside, drawn from my company's operating account not to impress, but to give back, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at it, then at me, then back again, as though trying to reconcile the girl who used to build toy circuits in the garage with the woman standing before him now. "I remember," he said finally, his voice low, "when you told me you wanted to build something that would outlast you. I didn't say much then, but I believed you." And just like that, the years of silence, of sidelong glances and muttered apologies, dissolved into something warmer, something real. My father had never fought for me publicly, had never challenged my mother's favoritism, or stood up to her judgments. But in that moment, I saw something in him I hadn't seen before. Regret, yes, but also admiration. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. When we returned to the table, no one asked about the envelope. No one dared. But the tension had shifted, the atmosphere charged with something unspoken. I raised my glass and offered a toast. Not to myself, that would have been too obvious, but to Eli, the only person at that table still untouched by pride or ego, still able to love without measuring. To Eli, I said, letting the words linger. May he never grow up thinking he needs anyone's approval to know his worth. The silence that followed was deeper than applause, more meaningful than praise. And in that silence, I knew I had finally done what I came to do. Not to shame them, not to gloat, but to reclaim the space they had always denied me, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. And as I looked across the table, at my mother's tight-lipped smile and my brother's downturned eyes, I felt nothing but clarity. The queen was never missing. She just stopped playing their game. The thing about quiet revolutions is that they don't come with trumpets or fireworks. No standing ovations or camera flashes to mark the moment when everything changes. Instead, they arrive like a slow exhale, the kind that's been building for years in lungs that have been holding their breath too long. And when that breath is finally released, it doesn't roar. It expands, fills the room, and settles into the corners where all the old certainties used to live. That night, after the last slice of cake had been picked at, and the guests had begun to peel off with their Tupperware and awkward goodbyes, the house started to deflate. Like a balloon losing air after the party it was meant to decorate has already faded into memory. My mother stayed in the kitchen, rearranging plates that didn't need rearranging, while Jason disappeared into the basement under the pretense of taking a work call that no one believed. And I found myself once again in the same room I used to tiptoe through as a teenager, desperate not to disturb a silence that always seemed to crack under the weight of things left unsaid. I thought I had closed the circle, thought the day had delivered what it was meant to, a subtle, calculated reckoning wrapped in poise and dressed in calmness. But I hadn't yet counted on my father, and as I turned the corner into the den, expecting only the empty glow of a television left on for noise, I found him sitting in his usual armchair, not watching the screen, not sipping anything, just sitting there with his elbows resting on the armrests, his fingers laced together in the thoughtful, almost hesitant way that always meant something was coming. He didn't speak right away, and I didn't rush to fill the silence, because if there's anything I've learned from the kind of man who chooses silence over confrontation, it's that when he finally does speak, you'd better listen, not because he's going to shout or demand your attention, but because his words, when they arrive, are deliberate, rare, and often heavier than they appear. "You know," he began, his voice lower than usual, not cracked with age, but thick with memory, "when you were 16, I went behind your mother's back and opened a small investment account in your name." I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard him, unsure if this was some kind of metaphor or segue, but the way he said it, plain, unadorned, like he was stating a weather report, told me he meant it exactly as it sounded. I put in a little every year, he continued, eyes focused not on me but on some point in the distance, as if looking too closely at me might break the spell of what he was about to admit. Not much at first. I didn't have much to give, but I believed in you, even when I didn't understand what you were doing, even when your mother called it foolish or irresponsible. I knew better. I saw it. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not anger, but something stranger, more destabilizing, something between gratitude and grief, because here was the man who had never once stood up for me in the heat of battle, who had kept his head down while I was minimized and dismissed, revealing that he had been fighting for me all along, just in a language I hadn't known how to interpret until now. Later, he said, when Thomas came into the picture and I realized who he was and what he meant to your company, I reached out to him, quietly told him I wanted in, not for the return, though that didn't hurt, but because I knew this was the only way I could still be part of your story, the real one. I stood frozen, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding, because I had spent so long assuming he was just collateral damage in my mother's campaign of hierarchy and order, had filed him away as gentle but ineffective, a man whose silence felt like complicity, even when I wanted to forgive it. And yet here he was, revealing that silence had been his armor, that while my mother built walls with her words, he had carved tunnels with his quiet actions. He handed me a folded piece of paper, an old transfer document with his name and mine, and a note scribbled in the margins in his clumsy left-handed scrawl. In case she ever needs to know someone believed in her before the world did. I sat down, unable to speak, the weight of the revelation pressing against every part of me that had grown used to surviving without support. Because for all the power I had claimed that day, for all the vindication and poetic justice, this was the one thing I hadn't planned for, the knowledge that even in my loneliest moments, I had not been entirely alone. We sat there for a long time, saying little, just existing in the kind of silence that felt restorative instead of stifling, and I realized, slowly and then all at once, that my father had given me something far more valuable than capital or shares or secret accounts. He had given me back the version of my past where I wasn't invisible, where someone had seen my fight and chosen to stand beside it, even if from the shadows. Eventually I stood, kissed him on the forehead, and walked back toward the kitchen, where my mother was still scrubbing a spotless counter with the kind of intensity that suggested she was trying to erase more than crumbs. She didn't look at me when I entered, just asked in a clipped voice if I had enjoyed the evening. I didn't answer, not directly. I placed the folder Thomas had given me, containing a printout of the funding announcement, a press release draft, and evaluation summary, on the counter next to her elbow and said calmly, "This is what the app thing became." She froze, sponge still in hand, water dripping slowly into the sink, her face caught in that impossible expression that lives between shock and pride and fear, the realization that something she had dismissed had grown teeth, had grown wings, had grown beyond her control. I didn't stay to watch her read it. I didn't need to. Some victories are louder in absence. As I stepped outside into the cooling air, the sky already turning that soft violet that comes just before darkness, Jason was standing at the edge of the yard, phone in hand, staring at nothing. He turned when he heard the door, eyes tired, face unreadable. For a moment I thought he might say something, some forced congratulations, some half-joking jab, some truce offered in the form of a brotherly shrug, but he didn't. Instead, he asked quietly, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" And I, standing there with the weight of years behind me and a future already unfolding beneath my feet, said only this, "Because none of you ever asked." I walked past him without waiting for a reply. The sound of the gate clicking shut behind me like a period at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. Because the truth is, stories like mine don't end neatly. They don't offer resolution wrapped in a bow or forgiveness that comes with confetti. They end with ambiguity, with the kind of silence that demands reflection rather than applause, and leaves everyone wondering whether the villain was ignorance, pride, or simply the refusal to look closer. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the best revenge isn't the empire you build, it's the moment they realize they never bothered to look up and notice it.